The Nevada sun hadn't even cleared the mountains when Captain Mara Holt stepped into the briefing tent, her polished helmet tucked under one arm, like a promise she wasn't sure anyone would let her keep. The familiar scent of jet fuel and morning coffee filled the air, mixing with the low hum of voices that belonged to pilots who knew they'd be flying today. She'd been at Nellis Air Force Base for 3 weeks now, assigned to the 64th Aggressor Squadron for red flag exercises. 3 weeks of watching other pilots climb into cockpits while she stood by with a clipboard, earning herself a call sign that stung more than any insult. Hold. As in, hold the line. Hold the fort. Hold your breath and maybe someday you'll get a chance. The main screen flickered to life, displaying the morning's sortie assignments. Major Rick Donovan, the exercise lead, stood at the front with his usual confident posture, stylus in hand. Delta 4 wheels up at 0627, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never doubted his place in the sky. Echo flight follows at 35-second spacing. Mara positioned herself near the back, close enough to hear, but far enough to avoid the casual cruelty that seemed to follow her like a shadow. She'd learned to make herself small in these moments, to blend into the background until she was needed, if she was needed. "Look who's back on standby," Lieutenant Jake Carson muttered to the pilot beside him, loud enough for half the tent to hear. "Better keep the coffee warm, Hold. Might be a long day of watching real pilots fly." The laughter that followed was brief but sharp, the kind that cuts without leaving visible wounds. Mara kept her expression neutral, her grip steady on her helmet. She'd heard worse, survived worse. But each joke, each dismissive glance, each time her name appeared at the bottom of the roster as Spare 5, felt like another small death of the dream she'd carried since she was 15 years old. The truth was, Mara Holt was one of the best. Pilots most of these men had never seen fly. Her simulation scores were flawless, her tactical knowledge encyclopedic, her instrument skills razor-sharp. But none of that mattered when you were the pilot who'd been grounded for 6 months after a training accident, the one whose deployment got reassigned while she was stuck in physical therapy, the one who'd had to watch her career pause while everyone else's moved forward. "Spare 5, call sign Hold," Major Donovan announced, barely glancing in her direction as the final roster appeared on screen. He tossed her a blank clipboard underhand. "Keep our backup sharp. Never know when someone might get dizzy or a jet might decide to quit." "I hear spares are good at multi-role support," another voice called out. "Coffee duty, paperwork, standing around looking ready." More chuckles. Mara caught the clipboard cleanly, her face betraying nothing. She'd mastered the art of appearing unaffected, of letting the words slide off her like rain off a canopy. But inside, something harder was forming, something that had been building through 3 weeks of being treated like a spare part instead of a pilot. Lieutenant David Palmer, one of the newer pilots, glanced back at her with something that might have been sympathy. He opened his mouth as if to say something and seemed to think better of it and looked away. Even the ones who might have been allies couldn't risk associating with the squadron's designated backup. As the briefing continued, Mara stood quietly by the supply crates, her posture perfect, her breathing controlled. Around her, the tent buzzed with the energy of pilots preparing for combat exercises, the kind of high-stakes training that separated the elite from the adequate. She knew she belonged in that energy, knew she could match any of them in the sky. But knowledge and opportunity were different things entirely. The morning light streaming through the tent flaps caught the insignia on her flight suit, the wings. That proved she'd earned her place here. But in this room, those wings felt more like a costume than credentials. She was Captain Mara Holt, call sign Hold, and everyone expected her to do exactly that: hold the line, hold the fort, hold her place at the back of the room while the real pilots flew. What they didn't know was that Mara had been preparing for this moment longer than any of them realized. While they joked and laughed and took their spots for granted. She'd been studying, training, perfecting every aspect of her craft. She'd been waiting for the moment when being the spare would finally matter. That moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beyond the operations building. Its vastness, a reminder of how small one person could feel in the machinery of military aviation. Mara sat in the ready room, her flight suit crisp despite the early hour, watching the primary pilots go through their pre-flight routines with the casual confidence of men who'd never doubted their place in the sky. A logbook lay open on the table before her, its pages filled with entries that told the story of a career interrupted. Intercept patterns, frequency notations, tactical scenarios, all documented in her precise handwriting, all practice for flights she might never take. She traced one of the diagrams with her fingertip, a perfect intercept arc that existed only on paper. Still studying hold? The voice belonged to Captain Brett Williams, one of Donovan's favorites. He stood in the doorway of the ready room, his helmet bag slung over his shoulder, grinning with the kind of superiority that came from knowing he'd be airborne in 20 minutes. You know they don't grade the spares, right? Mara closed the logbook without looking up, just staying sharp. Sharp for what? Williams laughed, settling into a chair across from her. You've been here 3 weeks and haven't flown a single sortie. Face it, hold you're not here to fly. You're here to make the rest of us look good by comparison. The words stung because they echoed the doubts that kept her awake at night. 3 weeks of perfect attendance, perfect preparation, perfect readiness, and nothing to show for it but a clipboard and a call sign that had become a joke. She'd started to wonder if Major Donovan had requested her specifically because he needed someone to fill the spare slot, someone whose presence would make the active pilots feel more secure in their positions. I heard about your little accident, Williams continued, his tone shifting to mock concern. Knee injury, right? During a low-altitude pullout. Must be tough, knowing you cracked under pressure when it mattered. Mara's jaw tightened. The accident had been mechanical failure, not pilot error. But the investigation had taken months, and by then the narrative was set. She'd become the pilot who'd been grounded, the one with the medical delay, the one whose record had a pause that made commanders hesitant to take risks. It wasn't, she started, then stopped. Explaining wouldn't change anything. It never had. Wasn't what? Wasn't your fault? Williams leaned back, enjoying himself. Funny how it's never the pilot's fault when they end up on the spare roster. The door opened and Lieutenant Palmer entered, his own gear in hand. He glanced between Williams and Mara, reading the tension in the room. Williams, aren't you supposed to be at pre-flight by now? Just having a friendly chat with our backup, Williams replied, standing slowly. Making sure she knows how important her job is. Someone's got to keep the bench warm. As Williams left, Palmer lingered. Don't listen to him, he said quietly. He's just what? Mara asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. Just telling the truth? I've been here 3 weeks, Palmer. 3 weeks of perfect readiness and 0 flight time. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not here to fly. Palmer sat down where Williams had been, his expression serious. You know what I think? I think Donovan's scared of you. Mara looked up, surprised. Scared of me? I've seen your simulation scores. I've heard the instructors talk about your tactical knowledge. You're not on the spare roster because you're not good enough. You're there because you're too good. Because if you got a chance to fly, you'd show up half the pilots in this squadron. The words offered a lifeline, a different way to interpret the isolation and dismissal. But Mara had learned not to trust hope too easily. If that were true, I'd be flying. Not necessarily, Palmer said. Sometimes, the best pilots are the ones who threaten the status quo. Sometimes keeping you on the bench is easier than dealing with what happens when you prove you belong in the sky. After Palmer left for his own pre-flight, Mara remained in the ready room, staring at her closed logbook. Through the window, she could see the flight line coming alive, pilots doing walk-arounds, crew chiefs making final checks, the controlled chaos of military aviation preparing for combat exercises. She thought about her father, about the photo on her desk of them standing next to that stripped-down F-16 frame when she was 15. He'd been a crew chief then, working his way up from enlisted to officer, never letting anyone tell him he didn't belong. Competence is quiet, he told her once. It doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to be ready when the moment comes. The moment. She'd been waiting for it for 3 weeks, for 6 months, for years. But waiting wasn't the same as preparing, and preparing wasn't the same as being ready. She was all three, had been all three, but in a system that valued connections over competence, familiarity over excellence, being ready wasn't always enough. A radio crackled to life, the voice of the air traffic controller coordinating the morning's flights. Delta flight, you're cleared for taxi. Echo flight, standby for runway assignment. Mara listened to the voices of pilots she'd trained with, studied with, competed against in every metric, except the one that mattered most: actual flight time. They were good pilots, most of them. But they were flying not just because of their skills, but because of their timing, their connections, their luck in avoiding the kind of medical delay that had derailed her career. She opened her logbook again, turning to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date, and below it, a single line. Still ready. It wasn't a prayer or a promise. It was a statement of fact, a reminder to herself that being overlooked wasn't the same as being obsolete. Somewhere in the vast machinery of military aviation, there was a place for her skills, her dedication, her quiet competence. She just had to be ready when the system finally called her name for something more than holding the line. The alarm that shattered the desert morning wasn't scheduled. Mara knew that immediately, the way a pilot knows the difference between routine noise and something wrong. She was in the middle of her morning equipment check when the speakers crackled to life across the base. All personnel, this is operations. We have a priority sortie change. Repeat, priority sortie change. Echo Flight 4. Report to medical immediately. Mara's hand stilled on her helmet case. Echo Flight 4 was Lieutenant Kevin Mason, one of the newer pilots, but still ahead of her in the rotation. She'd watched him suit up an hour ago, confident and joking with the others about the easy patrol mission they'd drawn. 20 minutes later, the word came down through the chain of command like a stone thrown into still water. Mason had developed severe vertigo during pre-flight, a disorienting condition that could be career-ending if it persisted. He was grounded immediately, pending medical evaluation. Mara was in the ready room when Major Donovan entered, his expression unreadable. She straightened automatically, the way she'd been trained to respond to authority, but her heart was racing with something she didn't dare name. "Halt," Donovan said, his voice carrying none of the casual dismissal she'd grown accustomed to. "Echo 4 needs filling. You're up." The words hit her like a physical blow, but not the kind that hurt. After 3 weeks of holding the line, she was finally being called to cross it. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. But then Donovan's expression shifted, and she saw something that made her stomach drop. Uncertainty, doubt, the look of a commander who was making a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "This is a routine patrol," he continued, his tone taking on the quality of a warning. "Eastern perimeter, standard reconnaissance. Nothing fancy, nothing that requires ... Creative interpretation." The phrase landed like a slap. Creative interpretation. As if her skills were somehow dangerous, as if giving her a chance to fly was a risk that needed to be managed. "I understand, sir," Mara said, but something in her tone must have betrayed her thoughts because Donovan's eyes narrowed. "Do you? Because I've seen your simulation scores, Holt. I've heard about your tactical innovations. But this isn't a classroom, and it's not a competition. This is a real mission with real consequences, and I need pilots who can follow orders, not ones who think they need to prove something." The words were a masterclass in professional humiliation, delivered with the kind of precision that left no room for response. Mara felt her face flush, but she kept her voice level. "I follow orders, sir. See that you do." Donovan turned to leave, then paused. "And Holt, don't make me regret this. There are a dozen pilots who could fill this slot if you can't handle the responsibility." After he left, Mara stood alone in the ready room, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for her gear. She'd waited 3 weeks for this moment, and now that it was here, it felt poisoned by the implication that she was getting a chance not because she'd earned it, but because she was the only option left. Lieutenant Palmer appeared in the doorway, his expression sympathetic. "I heard you got Mason's slot," he said quietly. "Congratulations. Did you hear the rest of it?" Mara asked, her voice bitter despite her efforts to control it. "The part where he made it clear he's doing me a favor I don't deserve." Palmer stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice intense. "Donovan's not worried about your flying. He's worried about what happens when you show everyone what you can do. He's built his reputation on managing a tight squadron, on being the guy who keeps everyone in line. If you go up there and prove you're better than half his primary pilots, what does that say about his judgment?" The insight hit her like a revelation. It wasn't about her competence. It was about the threat her competence posed to the existing order. She'd been kept on the bench not because she wasn't good enough, but because she was too good for the role they'd assigned her. "So what do I do?" she asked. "You fly," Palmer said simply. "You fly like you were born to it, like you've been preparing for this moment your entire life. And when you come back, you let the results speak for themselves." An hour later, Mara stood on the tarmac beside her assigned F-16, running through the pre-flight checklist with the kind of methodical precision that had become second nature. The jet was older than some of the others, its paint slightly faded, but the engines were strong and the avionics were clean. It would do. Around her, the usual chaos of flight operations continued. Pilots joking with their crew chiefs ground. Crews fueling and arming aircraft, the steady voice of air traffic control coordinating movements. But for the first time in 3 weeks, Mara felt like she was part of it instead of watching from the outside. She climbed into the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat with the familiarity of muscle memory. The canopy came down with a solid thunk, sealing her into the controlled environment where she'd always felt most at home. As the engine spooled up, she felt the vibration through the airframe, the promise of speed and altitude and the kind of freedom that could only be found in the sky. The radio crackled with clearance for taxi, and Mara acknowledged with the standard response. But inside, she was thinking about her father's words. Competence is quiet. It doesn't need to announce itself. Today, she thought, competence would speak for itself. She had no idea that her routine patrol was about to become anything but routine, or that the moment she'd been preparing for her entire career was waiting for her somewhere in the vast Nevada sky. The Nevada sky stretched endlessly above Mara as she settled into cruise altitude, her F-16 cutting through the thin air with the precision of a blade. For the first time in 3 weeks, she felt truly at home, not watching from the ready room, not standing by with a clipboard, but flying. The desert spread below her in patterns of gold and brown, familiar and comforting. "Echo 4, this is Control," the voice crackled through her headset. "Your patrol sector is Grid 77, Eastern Perimeter. Maintain altitude flight level. 210. Standard reconnaissance pattern. Copy. Control. Echo 4 proceeding to patrol sector. Her voice was calm, professional, but inside she was cataloging every sensation. The slight vibration of the stick, the steady hum of the engine, the way the horizon line held steady in her peripheral vision. This was what she'd been waiting for, what she'd been preparing for during all those long nights in the simulator. She was 40 minutes into the patrol when her radar picked up something that shouldn't have been there. A contact moving slowly across the edge of the restricted airspace. Too slow for a military aircraft, too steady for a drone. Her training kicked in immediately. Years of tactical instruction compressed into seconds of analysis. The contact wasn't squawking a proper military identifier, but it wasn't broadcasting civilian codes either. Control. This is Echo 4. I have an unidentified contact bearing 085, approximate distance 20 nautical miles. Contact appears to be civilian aircraft, but it's inside restricted airspace. The pause that followed was too long, filled with the kind of silence that meant confusion in the control tower. When the response came, it carried an edge of uncertainty that sent a chill down Mara's spine. Echo 4. We show no scheduled civilian traffic in your sector. Can you confirm visual identification? Mara adjusted her heading, closing the distance to the unknown aircraft. As she approached, the shape resolved into something that made her heart skip a beat. A twin-engine civilian aircraft, flying low and erratic, clearly in distress. She could see the medical cross painted on its fuselage, faded but unmistakable. Control. Visual confirmed. Medical aircraft. Appears to be a medevac helicopter. No, correction, fixed-wing aircraft. Civilian registration. Showing signs of distress. Aircraft is definitely lost and possibly an emergency. But even as she spoke, her radar was picking up something else. 2 fast-moving contacts approaching. From the west. Delta flight, she realized with growing horror. They were on an intercept course, their targeting systems already locked onto the civilian aircraft. Echo 4, this is Delta Lead. We have the contact in sight. Preparing to engage. Simulated target per exercise protocol. Delta Lead, negative. Mara's voice cut through the radio chatter with an authority that surprised even her. Contact is confirmed civilian medical aircraft in emergency status. Repeat, civilian aircraft, not a target. Echo 4, stand down. We have positive identification of hostile aircraft. Engaging now. Mara's blood ran cold. In the chaos of the exercise, Delta Flight had misidentified the civilian aircraft as a simulated enemy. They were seconds away from what would be a catastrophic mistake, not actual weapons fire, but a simulated engagement that would force the civilian pilot to take evasive action he might not be capable of in his current state. She had a choice to make, and she had seconds to make it. Follow protocol, stay in her assigned patrol pattern, and let Delta Flight handle what they believed was a legitimate target. Or break protocol, risk her career, and do what she knew was right. The decision was never really a choice at all. Delta Lead, this is Echo 4. I'm moving to intercept. That aircraft is civilian, and I'm taking responsibility for escort. Echo 4, you are not authorized for intercept. Return to patrol pattern immediately. But Mara was already banking hard left, her F-16 responding to her touch like an extension of her will. The G-forces pressed her into her seat as she pulled the aircraft into a steep diving turn, closing the distance to the struggling civilian plane. Control, this is Echo 4. I have visual on a civilian medevac aircraft. Registration unclear, showing signs of navigation failure and possible fuel emergency. Aircraft is inside restricted airspace, but poses no threat. Requesting immediate assistance for emergency escort. The response came not from control, but from Major Donovan himself, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Echo 4, you are ordered to return to patrol pattern immediately. Delta Flight has the intercept. Sir, Delta Flight has misidentified the target. That aircraft is civilian, and it's in distress. I'm in position to provide assistance. Echo 4, you are directly disobeying orders. Return to patrol pattern or face immediate grounding. Mara looked ahead at the struggling aircraft, now close enough to see the pilot's face through the cockpit window. He was young, maybe her age, and the fear in his expression was unmistakable. Behind her, Delta Flight was closing fast, their intentions unchanged despite her warnings. She keyed the radio one more time, her voice steady despite the career-ending choice she was about to make. Control, this is Echo 4. I'm taking responsibility for this contact. Beginning emergency escort procedures now. She switched to the emergency frequency, hoping the civilian pilot would hear her. Medical aircraft, this is U.S. Air Force Echo 4. I'm on your left wing. Follow my lead, and I'll get you out of restricted airspace safely. The civilian aircraft wobbled slightly, then steadied. Through the cockpit window, she saw the pilot's hand raised in acknowledgement. He'd heard her, and he was trusting her to save his life. Behind her, the radio exploded with angry voices, Donovan demanding her immediate return. Delta Flight requesting permission to proceed with intercept. Control trying to sort out the chaos. But Mara tuned it all out, focusing on the single most important thing. The aircraft beside her and the man whose life now depended on her disobedience. She'd spent 3 weeks being the perfect spare, the obedient backup who never questioned orders. But some things were more important than following orders. Some things required a pilot to trust their judgment over their chain of command. As she led the civilian aircraft toward the safety of unrestricted airspace, Mara knew she was flying toward the end of her career. But she also knew she was flying toward the moment that would define not just her skills as a pilot, but her character as a human being. The moment when being right more than being obedient. The silence in the control tower was deafening. Mara could hear it even through her headset, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone realizes something has gone terribly wrong. She maintained her position alongside the civilian aircraft, her F-16 steady despite the turbulence that was making the smaller plane struggle to maintain altitude. Echo 4, this is Major Donovan. You have 30 seconds to break off and return to base, or you will be relieved of duty immediately. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Mara looked through her canopy at the civilian pilot, who was clearly fighting to keep his aircraft stable. His medical equipment was visible in the cabin behind him, stretchers, monitors, the kind of gear that meant someone's life had already depended on his mission before he'd gotten lost in restricted airspace. Sir, she said, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. The civilian aircraft is still in distress. I cannot abandon escort until the pilot is safely out of restricted airspace. You can, and you will, Captain. That is a direct order. Mara's jaw tightened. She'd spent years following orders, being the perfect soldier, the obedient pilot who never questioned authority. But orders were meant to serve the mission, not the other way around. And right now, the mission was keeping an innocent pilot alive. Major Donovan, she said, switching to a frequency she knew would be recorded. I need you to understand what's happening here. This is a civilian medical aircraft, likely carrying medical supplies or personnel. The pilot is clearly experiencing navigation failure and possible fuel emergency. Delta Flight misidentified this aircraft as a hostile target and was preparing to engage. As the closest military asset, I have a responsibility to provide assistance. The legal language was deliberate. Mara had spent those long nights studying not just flying manuals, but military protocols, rules of engagement, and the regulations that governed exactly this kind of situation. She was gambling everything on the hope that someone in the chain of command would recognize she was following a higher authority than Major Donovan's anger. Echo 4, this is Control. A different voice now, calmer, more measured. Can you confirm the civilian aircraft's condition? Control, aircraft is showing signs of fuel emergency. Pilot appears to be alone. Aircraft is approximately 15 minutes from the nearest civilian airfield. I estimate current fuel reserves are marginal for safe landing. Through her peripheral vision, she could see Delta flight holding position about 2 miles out, clearly confused by the conflicting orders they were receiving. The lead pilot came over the radio, his voice uncertain. Control, Delta Lead. We're showing mixed signals on the target. Requesting clarification on rules of engagement. Delta Lead, hold position. Do not engage until we have positive target identification. It was a small victory, but Mara knew it was temporary. The civilian aircraft beside her was still struggling, and she could see the pilot's fuel gauge from her position. The needle was dropping into the red zone. Medical aircraft, she said, switching to the emergency frequency. What's your fuel status? Air Force ... I'm not sure. Maybe 20 minutes? My navigation system failed about an hour ago, and I've been trying to find a way out of this area. I was transporting blood supplies to a hospital in Vegas when everything went wrong. Blood supplies. The words hit Mara like a physical blow. This wasn't just about one lost pilot. It was about the patients who were depending on those supplies. The lives that hung in the balance while bureaucrats in the control tower worried about protocol. Don't worry, she told him. I'm going to get you home. But even as she spoke, she knew the situation was deteriorating. Her own fuel was fine, but the civilian aircraft was running on fumes. Worse, the nearest civilian airfield was still 10 minutes away, and that was if they flew direct, which meant continuing through restricted airspace. Echo 4, this is Major Perez from Base Operations. Another new voice, this one carrying the authority of higher rank. You are ordered to escort the civilian aircraft to the nearest point outside restricted airspace and then return to base immediately. The order was a compromise, but it was also a death sentence for the civilian pilot. The nearest exit point was 5 minutes away, but from there, it was another 15 minutes to the civilian airfield. The pilot didn't have that much fuel. Sir, Mara replied, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say. The civilian aircraft does not have sufficient fuel to reach safety if I escort him to the perimeter. He needs direct routing to the nearest airfield, which requires continued flight through restricted airspace. That airspace is closed for active military exercises, Captain. Civilian aircraft are not authorized. Then authorize it, sir. Or you're going to have a civilian casualty on your hands. The silence that followed was so complete that Mara could hear her own heartbeat. She just challenged not just Major Donovan, but the entire chain of command, backing them into a corner where they'd have to choose between their precious exercise and a human life. Echo 4, this is Colonel Harrison, Base Commander. The voice was crisp, authoritative, the kind that could end careers with a single word. You are certain the civilian aircraft cannot reach safety without continued escort through restricted airspace? Yes, sir. Fuel emergency is confirmed. Without direct routing, the pilot will not make it to the nearest airfield. Another pause, shorter this time. When Colonel Harrison spoke again, his voice carried the weight of command decision. All aircraft. This is Base Commander. Exercise suspended immediately. Civilian aircraft is authorized for emergency transit through restricted airspace. Echo 4. You have escort responsibility until civilian aircraft is safely on the ground. The words were like a dam breaking. Suddenly, the entire exercise, the thing that had been more important than one lost pilot, was secondary to the mission Mara had taken upon herself. Copy. Base Commander. Echo 4 maintaining escort. As she banked left to guide the civilian aircraft toward the distant airfield, Mara felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 weeks of being treated. Like a spare part. The weight of command, the responsibility that came with making decisions that mattered. Behind her, she could hear Major Donovan's voice on the radio, clipped and furious. "Colonel, I protest this decision." Captain Holt directly disobeyed orders and endangered the exercise. "Major," Colonel Harrison replied, his voice cutting through. The protest like a blade. Captain Holt prevented what could have been a catastrophic incident. "I suggest you consider what would have happened if Delta Flight had engaged a civilian medical aircraft carrying blood supplies." The silence that followed was different from the others, not confusion or anger, but the kind of quiet that comes when everyone realizes how close they came to disaster. Mara maintained her escort position, her aircraft steady beside the struggling civilian plane. She'd risked everything, her career, her reputation, her future, on the belief that doing the right thing mattered more than following orders. Now she was about to find out if she'd been right. The civilian airfield appeared ahead like a promised land, its single runway stretching across the desert floor. Mara had never been so relieved to see concrete in her life. Beside her, the medical aircraft was barely maintaining altitude, its engines coughing as the fuel pumps began to suck air. "Tower, this is military escort, requesting emergency landing clearance for civilian aircraft." She called to the small airfield's control tower. "Roger, military escort. Runway is clear. Emergency vehicles are standing by." The civilian pilot's voice came over the emergency frequency, tight with strain. "I don't know if I can make it. Engines are starting to sputter." "You're going to make it," Mara said, her voice carrying a certainty she didn't entirely feel. "See that runway? You're less than 2 miles out. Keep your nose down, maintain glide speed, and trust your training." She watched as the smaller aircraft descended, its approach looking more like a controlled crash than a landing. But the pilot held it steady, his hand sure on the controls despite the emergency. At the last second, the engines caught again, giving him just enough power to flare properly. The aircraft touched down hard but safely, rolling to a stop about halfway down the runway. Mara circled once, confirming the landing was successful, then headed back toward Nellis, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and dread. The radio had been ominously quiet during the escort to the civilian airfield. No congratulations, no acknowledgement of the successful mission. Just silence that felt like the calm before a storm. As she approached Nellis, the control tower finally spoke. "Echo 4, you are cleared for immediate landing. Proceed directly to the debriefing hangar upon touchdown. Do not shut down engines until instructed." The formal language told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a routine post-flight debriefing. This was a formal investigation, the kind that could end with court-martial charges. Mara touched down on the familiar runway, her F-16 rolling to a stop in front of the debriefing hangar. As she shut down the engines and opened the canopy, she could see the reception committee waiting for her. Major Donovan, Colonel Harrison, and several other officers she didn't recognize. Their expressions ranged from furious to carefully neutral. She climbed down from the cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady after the adrenaline of the past hour. As she walked toward the group, she noticed something that gave her a flicker of hope. Lieutenant Palmer was standing with the other pilots, and when he caught her eye, he gave her the slightest nod of approval. "Captain Holt," Colonel Harrison said, his voice formal but not unkind. "Report to the briefing room immediately. We need to discuss what happened up there." The briefing room was sterile and windowless, the kind of place where careers went to die. Mara sat at the long table, still in her flight suit, facing a panel of officers who held her future in their hands. Major Donovan sat to Colonel Harrison's right, his expression thunderous. "Captain," Colonel Harrison began, "you directly disobeyed orders from your superior officer. Explain your actions." Mara had rehearsed this moment during the flight back, but now that it was here, she found herself speaking from the heart rather than from preparation. "Sir, I observed a civilian aircraft in distress inside restricted airspace. The aircraft was misidentified as a hostile target by Delta Flight, who were preparing to engage. As the closest military asset, I determined that the immediate threat to civilian life outweighed the exercise protocols." "You determined," Major Donovan said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're a captain, Holt. You don't get to determine anything. You follow orders." "Sir, with respect, I followed the higher order, the preservation of human life." Colonel Harrison held up a hand to silence Donovan. "Continue, Captain." "The civilian aircraft was carrying blood supplies to a hospital in Las Vegas. The pilot had experienced navigation failure and was running critically low on fuel. Without direct escort through restricted airspace, he would not have made it to the nearest civilian airfield." "And you made this determination based on what authority?" Donovan demanded. "Based on my assessment of the situation and my training. As a military officer, sir, I've studied the regulations extensively. Military personnel have a duty to render aid to civilians in distress when it's within their capability to do so." It was a risky answer, but Mara had spent those long nights studying more than just flight manuals. She'd read every regulation, every protocol, every legal precedent that might apply to a situation like this. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that gave nothing away. "Captain Holt, are you familiar with Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice?" Mara's heart sank. Article 92 dealt with failure to obey orders, and it could result in court-martial. "Yes, sir." "Then you understand the seriousness of what you've done." He paused, letting the weight settle. "However, I'm also familiar with the Good Samaritan provisions of military law and the standing orders regarding aid to civilians in distress." Major Donovan's face flushed red. "Sir, she broke the chain of command. She endangered the exercise. And she saved a life, Major." The voice came from the doorway, where a man in a civilian suit had appeared, and possibly several others. Colonel Harrison stood. "Gentlemen, this is Agent Roberts from the NTSB. He's been investigating the incident." Agent Roberts moved to the front of the room, carrying a tablet. The civilian aircraft Captain Holt escorted was indeed carrying blood supplies type O negative. Specifically, that blood was destined for a pediatric surgery at University Medical Center. Without those supplies, a 6-year-old girl's operation would have been delayed indefinitely. The room fell silent. Mara felt something loosen in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Furthermore," Roberts continued, "our preliminary investigation shows that the pilot's navigation failure was caused by a solar flare that disrupted GPS systems across the region. He was flying blind, essentially with critically low fuel. Without Captain Holt's intervention, we would have had a civilian fatality." Major Donovan's jaw worked silently, but Colonel Harrison was nodding slowly. "What's your recommendation, Agent Roberts?" "My recommendation is that Captain Holt be commended for her actions. She prevented what could have been a tragedy, both in terms of the civilian casualty and the potential media disaster of military aircraft threatening a medical transport." The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, Colonel Harrison spoke. "Captain Holt, your actions today were unconventional. You broke protocol, disobeyed direct orders, and created a significant disruption to our training exercise." Mara braced herself for the inevitable punishment. "However," the colonel continued, "you also demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and leadership we expect from our officers when faced with life or death decisions. Sometimes doing the right thing requires courage to challenge authority. He stood, and the rest of the room followed suit. Major Donovan, I want a full review of our exercise protocols. We need to ensure that civilian aircraft emergencies are properly identified and handled in the future. Captain Holt, you'll be writing the new emergency response procedures based on today's experience. Mara blinked, hardly believing what she was hearing. Sir? You heard me, Captain. Someone who can think on their feet and make the hard decisions is exactly who should be writing our emergency protocols. He paused, then added with the hint of a smile, and effective immediately, you're off the spare roster. We're reassigning you to Alpha Flight as a primary pilot. The words hit her like a physical blow. After 3 weeks of being treated like a spare part, she was finally being recognized for what she'd always been, a pilot. As the meeting dispersed, Major Donovan approached her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might still try to retaliate. Instead, he extended his hand. Good flying up there, Captain, he said quietly. I was wrong about you. It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that was enough. The investigation took 3 days, and Mara spent every one of them in bureaucratic limbo. She wasn't grounded, but she wasn't flying either. Instead, she found herself relegated to administrative duties while a parade of investigators, safety officers, and command personnel dissected every second of her unauthorized rescue mission. She'd expected the isolation, but what surprised her was the support. Lieutenant Palmer made a point of sitting with her at meals, deflecting the whispered conversations and pointed stares. Even some of the pilots who joined in the jokes about Hold seemed uncertain now, as if they were beginning to question whether the spare pilot might have been the most qualified one all along. On the morning of the 3rd day, Mara was summoned to Colonel Harrison's office. She entered to find not just the base commander, but General Rebecca Walsh, the wing commander, a woman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for incompetence. Captain Holt, General Walsh said without preamble, I've been reviewing the incident reports from 3 days ago, and I have some questions. Mara stood at attention, her mind racing. The presence of a general meant this had gone far beyond a simple disciplinary matter. Yes, ma'am. Sit down, Captain. This isn't a formal proceeding. General Walsh consulted a tablet. I'm interested in your background. You've been with the 64th for 3 weeks, but your service record shows some gaps. Here it was, the medical delay, the missed deployment, all the reasons she'd been relegated to spare status. Yes, ma'am. I was grounded for 6 months following a training accident. A training accident that was ruled mechanical failure, not pilot error. General Walsh's eyes were sharp. Yet somehow you ended up on the spare roster at one of our premier training squadrons. Explain that to me. Mara chose her words carefully. Ma'am, after the medical delay, there were concerns about my readiness for deployment. The spare assignment was considered appropriate while I regained the confidence of my superiors. I see. General Walsh exchanged a look with Colonel Harrison. And during those 3 weeks, how many flight hours were you assigned? None, ma'am. None. Despite having some of the highest simulation scores in the squadron and tactical knowledge that exceeds many of our senior pilots. The general's tone was dangerously neutral. Major Donovan, would you join us, please? Donovan entered the office, his usual confidence notably absent. He took the offered chair beside Mara, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. Major, General Walsh continued, I've been reviewing Captain Holt's service record and her performance during the recent incident. Help me understand why a pilot of her caliber was assigned to spare duty with 0 flight time. Donovan cleared his throat. Ma'am, Captain Holt's record showed some concerns about her ability to handle high-pressure situations following her Medical delay. The spare assignment allowed us to evaluate her readiness without risk to primary operations. Interesting theory, General Walsh replied. And yet, when faced with the highest pressure situation possible, a civilian life hanging in the balance, she performed flawlessly. Her decisions were tactically sound, legally justified, and ultimately saved lives. Does that sound like someone who can't handle pressure? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Mara could see Donovan struggling with an answer that wouldn't make his position worse. Furthermore, the general continued, I've been in contact with Captain Holt's previous commanders. The consensus is unanimous. She's one of the most capable pilots they've ever worked with. So I'm wondering how she ended up being treated as anything less than that here. Colonel Harrison leaned forward. General, if I may, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about Captain Holt's assignment. Has there? General. Walsh's voice could have frozen water. Because from where I sit, it looks like we had one of our best pilots sitting on the bench while less qualified personnel flew missions. And the only reason anyone noticed was because she had the courage to disobey orders to save a civilian life. The words landed like bombs in the small office. Mara felt vindicated and terrified in equal measure. She'd wanted recognition, but not at the cost of destroying other people's careers. Ma'am, she said quietly. Major Donovan was following. Establish protocols for pilots returning from medical delay. General Walsh turned to her with something that might have been approval. Loyalty to your chain of command is admirable, Captain. But protecting incompetent leadership isn't loyalty, it's enabling. She stood, and everyone else followed suit. Major Donovan, you'll be transferred to a staff position effective immediately. Your replacement will be someone who recognizes talent instead of trying to bury it. Donovan's face went pale, but he didn't protest. He simply nodded and left the office without another word. Captain Holt, General Walsh continued, you're being assigned as the new Assistant Operations Officer for the 64th Squadron. Your first task will be reviewing our pilot evaluation and assignment procedures to ensure this kind of mismanagement doesn't happen again. The promotion was more than Mara had ever hoped for, but it came with a weight she hadn't expected. Ma'am, I'm honored, but nothing, Captain. 3 days ago, you showed the kind of judgment and courage we need in our leadership. The question is whether you're ready to use those qualities to fix a system that failed you and potentially countless others. As Mara left the colonel's office, her head was spinning. In the span of 3 days, she'd gone from being the forgotten spare to being placed in a position where she could ensure no other qualified pilot would be overlooked or undermined. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also exactly what she'd been preparing for during all those long nights studying regulations and procedures. She'd thought she was just trying to be ready for her chance to fly. Instead, she'd been preparing for her chance to lead. Lieutenant Palmer was waiting in the hallway, along with several other pilots. The word had already spread that Donovan was out, and the spare pilot was now in charge of operations. So, Palmer said with a grin, I guess they figured out you weren't the problem after all. Mara looked at the faces around her, some curious, some concerned, some openly relieved. These were good pilots who'd been caught in a system that valued conformity over competence. Now it was her job to change that system. No, she replied, her voice steady with newfound purpose. But I think I might be part of the solution. 6 months later, Captain Mara Holt stood in the same briefing tent where she'd once been dismissed as just another spare, but everything else had changed. The pilots filling the chairs weren't the same ones who'd made jokes about holding the line. Those attitudes had been grounded along with the commanders who'd fostered them. Good morning, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. Today's exercise involves civilian aircraft emergency protocols procedures. that every pilot in this squadron will master before they're cleared for combat operations. She clicked to the first slide, showing the radar signature that had started everything 6 months ago. Some of you may remember this contact. A civilian medevac aircraft that wandered into restricted airspace during a fuel emergency. What happened? Next became a case study in how to handle unexpected situations. Lieutenant Palmer, now wearing captain's bars himself, raised his hand. "Ma'am, wasn't that the incident where someone disobeyed direct orders to save the civilian pilot?" Mara smiled, the same composed expression that had served her through a career-defining moment. "That's one way to describe it, Captain Palmer. Another way would be to say that a pilot recognized that sometimes following the spirit of our mission requires challenging the letter of our orders." The new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Torres, nodded from her position at the back of the tent. Torres had been brought in specifically to implement the changes that Mara's experience had highlighted. Under her leadership, the squadron had become a model for other units struggling with similar issues. "The point," Mara continued, "is that good judgment can't be programmed into a checklist. It has to be developed through training, experience, and the confidence to act when the situation demands it." She clicked to the next slide, showing the updated emergency response protocols that had been adopted Air Force-wide. These procedures exist because one civilian pilot's emergency became everyone's learning opportunity. But they're only as good as the pilots who implement them. After the briefing, Mara walked the flight line, a routine that had become sacred to her. The same desert stretched to the horizon, the same jets sat ready for action, but the atmosphere was different. Pilots who might have been overlooked or dismissed now had clear pathways for advancement. The spare roster had been restructured to ensure that backup assignments were training opportunities rather than punishments. She stopped at the aircraft she'd flown on that crucial day, now bearing the maintenance chief's careful attention. Senior Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd been there for the whole transformation, looked up from his inspection. "Captain," he said with a grin, "she's ready for whatever you can throw at her. Just like always." "Good to hear, Chief. How are the new pilots adjusting?" "Better than expected. They actually seem excited about the possibility of being called up for real missions instead of dreading it. Funny how that works when people feel valued." It was a simple observation, but it captured everything that had changed. The squadron's performance metrics had improved across the board, not because they'd recruited better pilots, but because they'd finally started using the talent they'd already had. Mara's radio crackled with an incoming message. "Operations. To Captain Holt, we have a priority tasking for you." She keyed the radio, already moving toward the operations building. "Copy. Operations. On my way." Inside the ops center, the atmosphere was controlled chaos, the good kind that came from professionals handling a developing situation. Lieutenant Colonel Torres looked up from the main display as Mara entered. "We've got a situation developing over Nevada Test Range," Torres said without preamble. "Civilian aircraft, possible medical emergency, requesting emergency transit through restricted airspace. Sound familiar?" Mara studied the radar display, her mind automatically cataloging the details. How many souls on board? Unknown. But the pilot sounds young and scared, and he's specifically asking for the Air Force captain who helped the medevac pilot last year. Apparently, word gets around in the civilian aviation community. The request was irregular, but not unprecedented. Mara's handling of the original incident had become something of a legend among civilian pilots operating near military airspace. Several had specifically requested her assistance when they found themselves in similar situations. "I'll take it," she said, already reaching for her gear. "I thought you might." Torres handed her a flight assignment tablet. "Echo 1 is fueled and ready." "And Mara?" Show them what professional excellence looks like. 20 minutes later, Mara was airborne, climbing toward the coordinates where another pilot needed her help. As she leveled off and adjusted her heading, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she'd been the spare pilot that nobody wanted to see succeed. Now she was the go-to person for the situations that demanded the best of what military aviation could offer. Her radio crackled with the voice of the civilian pilot, tense with fear but steadied by hope. Air Force, this is Cessna 47 Delta. I heard you might be able to help me. Cessna 47 Delta, this is Echo 1. I've got you on radar, and I'm moving to assist. What's your situation? As she banked toward the struggling aircraft, Mara felt the same sense of purpose that had guided her 6 months ago. The difference was that now she wasn't alone in understanding what it meant to serve. She was part of a squadron that valued competence over politics, judgment over blind obedience, and the courage to do the right thing even when it was difficult. The spare pilot had become the standard by which others were measured. But more importantly, she'd helped create a system where no qualified pilot would ever again be dismissed as just another spare part. As the civilian aircraft came into view, struggling but still flying, Mara keyed her radio with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. "Don't worry," she said, her voice steady with the authority earned through fire. "I'm going to get you home safe." Behind her, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly, the same landscape where she'd once been ignored and dismissed. But ahead lay clear sky and the certainty that competence, given the chance to prove itself, would always rise above the noise. She was no longer Captain Holt, call sign Hold. She was Echo 1, and she was exactly where she belonged. Sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room belongs to the person who has been quietly preparing for their moment. Mara's story reminds us that being overlooked isn't the same as being unworthy, and that true leadership often begins with the courage to do what's right regardless of the consequences. Her quiet strength and unwavering competence didn't just save lives, they transformed an entire system. If this story resonates with your own experiences of being underestimated or overlooked, remember that preparation and integrity create their own opportunities. Excellence doesn't need permission to shine. It only needs the courage to act when the moment arrives. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.